Every year, on the morning of my birthday, a stranger deposited $50,000 into my bank account. This went on for 5 years, and I never knew who he was. But one afternoon, the bank called. "Ma'am, $60 million has just been deposited into your account, and there is a message attached from the sender." When I read it, I sat down on my kitchen floor and I did not get up for a long time. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. I used to think that ordinary was the safest thing a life could be. Bellwether, Vermont, population 15,000, a covered bridge that flooded every spring, and a small brick elementary school where I had worked as the school nurse for 13 years. That was my life. Rachel Coleman, 44 years old, divorced, mother of one 16-year-old son named Ethan, owner of a 2009 Honda Civic with air conditioning that had stopped working the summer Ethan turned 12 and never started again. I knew every back road out of that town. I knew which gas station had the cheapest milk and which grocery clerk would let a declined card slide through a second time without saying anything. For a long time, I believed that knowing your place was the same thing as being at peace with it. My father, Daniel Coleman, had died 7 years before any of this began. He died in the guest room of my sister's house in Rutland, thin as a violin string, owing more than he had ever earned in his best year. That was the story I had been told, and the story I had carried without questioning it, the way you carry grief when you have no reason to doubt its shape. My father had been a luthier, a maker of violins and cellos, trained in Cremona for 2 years in his 20s before coming home to open a small workshop with his college friend and business partner, a man named Victor Ashcombe. Coleman and Ashcombe Stringed Instruments had built a modest but respected name through the 80s and early 90s, selling handmade instruments to conservatories up and down the Northeast. Then, in 1996, the partnership dissolved, and my father never fully recovered. He spent the last decade of his life repairing school band violins for $40 apiece, and never once explained why the good years had ended. He only said, once, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never drank, "Some men take the thing you built with your own hands, Rachel, and the world calls it business." I didn't ask him what he meant. Ethan was a baby then, colicky and loud in the next room, and I told myself it was an old craftsman's bitterness talking. I told myself a great many things back then. My divorce from Mark had been finalized 5 years earlier. Clean on the paperwork, complicated in every other way. Mark wasn't cruel. He simply wasn't there, the way a coat hook on the wall is there without ever holding a coat. After he moved to New Hampshire, it was just Ethan and me, a mortgage that made my stomach tighten every first of the month, and a nursing salary that stretched exactly as far as it needed to and not $1 further. I picked up weekend shifts at an urgent care clinic outside of town. I clipped coupons out of habit long after they'd become somewhat embarrassing to use. We were not poor, but we were one broken furnace away from poor, and I knew it every single day. Then, on the morning of my 40th birthday, in early April, I woke to a bank notification on my phone. My checking account, which I had counted down to the last $11 the night before while paying the electric bill, now read $50,011. I sat up in bed and read it 3 times. I opened the app again. I called the automated line and listened to the balance twice, certain I had misheard a number somewhere. I hadn't. $50,000 had landed in my account overnight. I drove to the branch the next morning convinced it was a clerical error. The teller, a young man named Owen who always smelled faintly of the coffee shop next door, pulled up my account and frowned in the pleasant, non-committal way that bank employees are trained to frown. "Yes, ma'am. Wire transfer came in yesterday at 6:02 a.m. He slid a printout across the counter. The transfer had originated from a holding account I didn't recognize, routed through a private banking institution in Boston I had never heard of, and the sender field read-only gift. "Is this some kind of scam?" I asked, which is possibly the most Vermont thing I have ever said in my life. Owen smiled carefully. "It appears to be a legitimate transfer, Miss Coleman. If you didn't request it, you're welcome to flag it for review, but the funds are real and they're yours to keep unless someone formally disputes it." I drove home with that printout folded into the pocket of my coat and told myself it would sort itself out within the week. It did not sort itself out. I waited for a phone call, a letter, an apologetic email from some bank in Boston explaining a routing mistake. None came. I opened a separate savings account and moved the entire $50,000 into it, as though putting it somewhere else in my financial life might keep it from touching the rest of me. I paid my mortgage that month the way I always had, from my own paycheck. I did not spend a single dollar of it. Some instinct in me, the same one that makes a nurse double-check a dosage even when she's already checked it twice, told me that money you can't explain is a bill you haven't seen yet. A year passed. Nothing happened on the account for 12 months, and I had almost let myself believe it truly had been some strange, one-time clerical accident, the kind of story you tell at a dinner party and everyone laughs about. Then my birthday came around again, and at 6:02 a.m., $50,000 landed in my account a second time. Same sender field, same word, gift, same private institution in Boston. I sat at my kitchen table that morning with Ethan's cereal bowl still out from breakfast and felt something in my chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite excitement. It was closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing at the top of a staircase in the dark, unsure how many steps there are before the floor. I told no one, not Ethan, not my closest friend, Priya Patel, who taught 4th grade down the hall from the nurse's office, and who I had known since our sons were in the same daycare class. Not my sister in Rutland, who still hadn't forgiven me for missing her 40th birthday dinner because Ethan had strep throat. No one. I began keeping a small green notebook, the kind meant for shopping lists, and in it I logged the date, the amount, and the exact time of each transfer. There was something about writing extraordinary information into an ordinary object that made it feel more contained, more survivable. I filed every bank printout inside a hollowed-out biography of Antonio Stradivari that had belonged to my father, tucked on the highest shelf of my bedroom bookcase where dust and disinterest kept it safe from prying eyes. By the 3rd birthday, I had $150,000 sitting untouched in an account I barely let myself look at. I had also started sleeping badly. I would wake at 3 in the morning with the specific, nagging anxiety of someone who has found a key to a door she cannot locate. I would lie there and listen to Ethan's old box fan humming through the wall and think about my father at my kitchen table. Some men take the thing you built with your own hands, Rachel, and the world calls it business. I began to wonder, in the quiet hours, whether someone out there was trying to give something back. By the 4th birthday, I had established 3 facts I could not argue myself out of. First, the transfers were exact. Never a day early, never a day late, never a dollar more or less than $50,000, always at 6:02 in the morning. Second, the private institution in Boston specialized in wealth management for high-net-worth individuals and corporate trusts, not the kind of bank that makes accidental gifts to a school nurse in rural Vermont. This was deliberate. Someone had planned this down to the minute, year after year. Third, in 4 years, I had not told a single living soul. The silence had a weight of its own by then. I had spent those years in a kind of suspended waiting, the way you wait on thin ice, afraid that any motion in any direction might be the wrong one. By the 5th month of the 4th year, I made an appointment with a tax attorney 2 towns over, describing my situation in careful hypotheticals. No names, no specifics. He told me, in the measured language attorneys use when they don't want to be quoted, that unreported income above a certain threshold created real legal exposure. He told me I should report it. He also told me that if the money's origin was ever tied to anything illegal, keeping it, even unknowingly, could implicate me personally. I drove home from that appointment and sat in the school parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Here is what I knew about myself at 43. I was not a dramatic person. I did not make scenes. I did not confront people across crowded rooms. I gave children their asthma inhalers on schedule and called worried parents in a calm, even voice. But I was stubborn in a quiet way, the way my father had been stubborn about sanding a scroll for the 9th time until the curve was exactly right. Mark used to call that a character flaw. I had decided somewhere between the divorce and my father's funeral that he was wrong. So I sat in that parking lot and made myself be honest with myself for the first time in 4 years. I was afraid of who was sending the money. I was afraid that finding out would force me to give it back. Or worse, would drag Ethan and me into something we had no business being anywhere near. But I was also afraid of the alternative, spending the rest of my life carrying a secret that had been placed inside my life without my consent. That fear was the one that finally moved me. Not greed, not courage, exactly. The plain indignity of not knowing. I made a plan, not a dramatic plan, a nurse's plan, methodical, documented, one careful step at a time. Step 1. Gather everything I had, every printout, every entry in the green notebook, every date and time. Step 2. Find someone who could trace a private wire transfer without triggering whatever alarm might be attached to my own inquiries. I had heard, once, from another nurse at the clinic, about a private investigator in Burlington who had helped a coworker track down a missing ex-husband's hidden assets during a custody dispute. Her name was Renata Voss. I called her office on a Thursday afternoon during my lunch break, using the school's landline instead of my own cell phone, for reasons I couldn't fully explain even to myself. The appointment was set for the following week. I slept better that night than I had in nearly a year. Renata Voss's small office was above a bicycle repair shop on Church Street in Burlington, which struck me as oddly reassuring. She was a tall woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried attentiveness of someone who has spent decades listening to people who are afraid to say the whole truth all at once. Her office was lined with filing cabinets, each one labeled in a neat, no-nonsense hand. I laid everything out on her desk. The green notebook, 4 years of printouts, my attorney's careful non-notes, my timeline written out on a single legal pad. She read through all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, she looked up over the top of her reading glasses. "You've done more of my job than most of my actual clients," she said. It sounded like the highest compliment she was capable of giving. "I'm a nurse," I told her. "That explains the notebook." She tapped the printout with the Boston institution's routing information. "This is a private banking layer. Perfectly legal, commonly used by wealthy individuals who want to keep gifts or settlements off the public radar. Whoever's sending this has resources and legal sophistication. This is not somebody's mistake, and it's not random." "I know," I said. "Any guess who it might be?" I had been circling one name in my mind for over a year, pushing it away every time it surfaced because it felt too enormous to say out loud. "My father had a business partner," I said finally, "in the instrument-making business. His name was Victor Ashcombe. They built violins and cellos together starting in the early 80s. The partnership dissolved in 1996. My father never really recovered afterward. Victor Ashcombe did." Renata wrote the name down without any visible reaction. "Did your father ever tell you why the partnership ended?" "He said it just fell apart. He never gave me the details. He said once that some men take the thing you built with your own hands, and the world calls it business." Renata looked up. "You think he meant Ashcombe?" "I didn't think it meant anything, back then. I think it now." She told me it would take her 2 to 3 weeks. Corporate dissolution records were public. She could trace the geography of the intermediary institution and cross-reference it with any entities connected to Ashcombe's name without directly requesting the sender's identity, which the bank legally could not disclose to me. I wrote her a check from my personal account. not a single dollar of the mysterious money, and drove back to Bellwether with the windows down despite the cold April air. 12 days later, Renata called. "The originating institution," she said, without any preamble, "is a private wealth management arm based in Boston that handles the personal accounts of Ashcombe String Instruments, the company Victor Ashcombe founded after your father's partnership dissolved. It's a fairly large operation now. High-end orchestral instruments, some manufacturing contracts with conservatories across the country." A pause. "Rachel, Victor Ashcombe died 6 weeks ago. Heart failure. He was 81. The words landed somewhere strange, out of order, like a chord played with the wrong finger. I sat down at my kitchen table, which is where I happened to be standing when the call came through, and I stayed there for a long time after we hung up. He had died, and the transfers, I already knew, without needing Renata to tell me, had started on my birthday, which fell 6 weeks after his death. Would have been too late for the fifth one to have come from him directly. I did the math in my head, frantic and disbelieving. The transfers had, in fact, already stopped being possible to send personally. Someone, or something, some instrument already set in motion, had sent the fifth one regardless. There was more. Renata had pulled the old dissolution filings for Coleman and Ashcombe Stringed Instruments from 1996, and through a contact with access to Vermont Civil Court archives, she had found something filed and quietly settled the following year. A complaint brought by my father, Daniel Coleman, against Victor Ashcombe, alleging that Ashcombe had secretly patented and commercialized 2 of my father's original instrument designs, a proprietary bracing pattern and a varnish formulation my father had spent a decade perfecting, under his own name, cutting my father out of both credit and profit entirely. The complaint had been settled out of court. The terms were sealed. My father had never told me. He had spent the next 20 years of his life fixing $40 school violins while the designs he'd invented, under someone else's name, built an empire. Sitting at that kitchen table, I finally understood what had been happening for 4 years. Victor Ashcombe had sent me $50,000 a year, $250,000 over 5 birthdays, counting the one that had just arrived, as a kind of penance, a debt he had spent decades running from and could not outrun in the end. And now Victor Ashcombe was dead, which meant there was an estate, which meant there might be more. Renata cleared her throat gently over the phone. "Rachel, there's something you should probably know about his will. The will changed everything." Renata had a contact at a probate office in Boston, someone she had worked with before who understood exactly where the line sat between what could be shared informally and what could not. What she told me 2 days later, over the phone, in a voice careful enough that I knew she was choosing each word, was this: Victor Ashcombe's estate carried a total assessed value of approximately $68 million, and one specific provision of his amended will named Rachel and Coleman as the sole beneficiary of a trust valued at $60 million, to be released upon the completion of probate. $60 million. I sat with that number the way you sit with a number too large to be real, the kind that belongs to lottery headlines and hedge fund managers, not to a school nurse who drove a Civic with broken air conditioning and packed her son's lunch in the same reused Tupperware for 3 years running. I wrote it down in the green notebook just to make it exist somewhere outside my own head. Even in my own handwriting, it looked like a typo. I hired a real attorney this time, not a 1-hour hypothetical consultation, but a full estate litigation attorney named Diane Foss, based in Burlington, a reputation Renata described as quietly relentless. I used a portion of the accumulated birthday money to pay her retainer. It felt, in a strange way, appropriate. Victor Ashcombe's money paying to secure what Victor Ashcombe had left behind. Diane reviewed everything. Renata's findings, the sealed 1997 settlement, the bank records, the will's language. She sat across from me in her office with the stillness of someone who has seen nearly everything and is rarely surprised by any of it. "This is an unusually direct testamentary provision," she said. "If the will holds, This bequest is yours, cleanly. If it holds, I repeated. There's a contest, Diane said. His son, Julian Ashcombe, who currently runs the company, filed an objection to the trust provision 11 days ago. He's arguing his father lacked testamentary capacity when the will was amended, and separately, that there was undue influence involved. Undue influence from whom? You, presumably. I stared at her. I never met the man. I found out the transfers were from him 3 weeks ago. I know, Diane said, which is exactly what makes this particular objection somewhat bold. She allowed herself the thinnest of smiles. Julian Ashcombe has retained a firm out of Boston. Prescott and Hale. Expensive, aggressive, and I've beaten them once before. I liked Diane Foss immediately, and more than that, I trusted her. Julian Ashcombe was 49, Victor's only son, and he had run the manufacturing and licensing side of a company for over a decade. His younger sister, Vivian Ashcombe Reyes, had filed a supporting brief alongside his objection. I looked them both up after Ethan had gone to bed. Julian's headshot radiated the confidence of a man who had never once wondered whether a check would clear. Vivian's social media was full of photographs from a lake house in Maine. They were the kind of people surrounded by money for so long they'd mistaken it for a personality trait. 4 days after Diane filed our initial response, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice, smooth, unhurried, with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to being the most important person in every conversation he entered. Miss Coleman, this is Julian Ashcombe. I'd like to speak with you directly before this becomes any more complicated than it needs to be. I stood very still in my kitchen. Ethan was at soccer practice. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum. I'm listening, I said. My father was an elderly man who made some decisions in his final year that concerned this family a great deal. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you may have been the recipient of an old man's confusion and guilt, nothing more. I'd like to resolve this reasonably before it costs either of us more than it should. A pause, timed with the precision of long practice. I'm prepared to offer you a settlement of $500,000. I think you'd agree that's a very significant sum. In exchange, you withdraw from the probate proceeding entirely. $500,000 against $250,000 already sent and a $60 million estate. I'll need to speak with my attorney, I said. Of course, he said, warmth pooling back into his voice like nothing had happened. Take your time. I called Diane the moment I hung up. They're testing you, she said. That number is an insult, and they know it is. If you take it, it tells them you can be bought cheap and scared off before this ever reaches a courtroom. What should I do? Decline politely in writing, and then let me handle Julian Ashcombe. I sent the formal, written decline through Diane's office the following morning. That same week, 2 things happened. First, an unfamiliar car sat parked outside the school for the better part of 3 hours on a Wednesday, and one of the crossing guards mentioned it to me, unprompted, in the kind of small-town way that meant everyone had noticed. Second, Ethan texted me from soccer practice to say a man he didn't recognize had approached him near the parking lot afterward and asked, casually, whether his mother had gotten any interesting news lately. I called Diane. Then I called the Bellwether Police non-emergency line. Then I drove home, sat Ethan down at the kitchen table, and told him everything start to finish. He listened with the particular stillness that teenagers reserve for the exact moment they realize their parent is a real, complicated, frightened person and not simply mom. When I finished, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. So we fight, he said. We fight? I said back. I slept 5 hours that night. It was enough. The following weeks were quiet in the way weather goes quiet before it turns. Julian Ashcombe did not call again. The unfamiliar car did not reappear outside the school. Vivian Ashcombe Reyes' attorney filed 2 procedural motions in probate court, both of which Diane described as delayed tactics with no real substance. Life in Bellwether continued along its ordinary rhythms: the covered bridge, the school bell, Ethan making himself dinner 3 nights a week without being asked, something he'd never done before. But the calm felt watched. I can't describe it any other way. I would unlock the nurse's office and feel the specific, prickling sensation of being observed by someone I couldn't identify or prove was there. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Which cars slowed near my street, which unfamiliar emails sent me vague research inquiries, which new followers had profiles that were too thin, too recent, too convenient. On a Tuesday in late October, an email arrived from an unofficial address, not a legal correspondence address at all. The message was short. It said Victor Ashcombe had left private letters with instructions for them to be delivered to me after his death, that these letters would explain his reasoning, and that if I wanted them, I should meet a representative at a hotel restaurant in Boston that Saturday. I forwarded it to Diane immediately. Her reply came within the hour. Do not respond. Do not attend. This is either a phishing attempt or an attempt to manufacture contact that can be used against you in court. I'm flagging it with opposing counsel directly. I did not respond. I did not attend. But I thought about those letters constantly, the idea that somewhere, in Victor Ashcombe's own handwriting, an explanation existed. It was the part that cut deepest, deeper than the money ever did. A man had spent 5 years trying to make something right through the only language he trusted, wire transfers, routing numbers, silent birthday deposits, and had never once simply said, in plain English, I'm sorry and here is why. That Saturday, instead of driving to Boston, I drove to Priya Patel's house. I had told her nothing for nearly 5 months by that point. We still ate lunch together most days in the teacher's lounge, still talked about her twins and my son, and whether the new coffee place on Main Street was worth the extra $1. It hadn't been, and I'd said nothing about that either. The weight of the silence had become its own kind of exhaustion, and I had finally reached the point where carrying it alone was doing more damage than telling the truth ever could. I sat at Priya's kitchen table, the good kind of kitchen, cluttered and warm, with her enormous orange cat weaving figure eights around my ankles, and I told her everything, from the very first birthday deposit to Julian Ashcombe's phone call. She listened without interrupting once, the way she listens to a nervous parent explain a medication schedule, taking in every detail with total seriousness. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Your dad knew, she said finally. Some version of it, yeah. And he settled back then for what? Enough to survive, but not enough to actually rebuild. That's what Diane thinks. The sealed terms probably had a non-disclosure clause built in. Priya set down her mug. So Ashcombe bought your father's silence for just enough to keep him from starving, and spent the rest of his life feeling guilty about it, and then left you the whole thing at the end. When she said it plainly like that, it sounded exactly like what it was. A story about a man who had taken a shortcut through someone else's life's work and spent the rest of his own life quietly paying the toll. What do you need from me? Priya asked. That question was the entire reason I'd come. Not sympathy. That question. I need one person in my actual life who knows the whole picture, I said. I've been carrying this alone for almost a year, and it's making me slower, more scared than I need to be. Then I know it now, she said simply. What else? If this goes to court and I need to travel, I need someone Ethan can stay with who doesn't need to be briefed on everything from scratch. Done, she said, before I'd even finished the sentence. I drove home that evening with the windows cracked despite the cold, and for the first time in months I didn't feel watched. I felt, instead, like someone who had chosen, deliberately, not to be alone with it anymore. There is a particular kind of courage in that. Not the loud kind. The kind that looks like a Saturday afternoon at a friend's kitchen table. It is, I've come to believe, the most durable kind there is. They came to Bellwether on a Thursday in November. Diane called ahead to let me know. The Ashcombe attorneys had formally requested a mediation session, which in probate matters is sometimes court-ordered and sometimes entirely voluntary. This one was voluntary on their end, which Diane said was, in itself, interesting. They want to talk outside the courtroom, she told me. That usually means they're recalculating something. Let them come, I said. We listen. We commit to nothing. We learn more than they mean to tell us. The mediation was held in a conference room at a law office in downtown Bellwether, technically neutral ground, though it was a firm Julian's attorneys had suggested and Diane had agreed to without much resistance. I sat on one side of the table with Diane. Julian Ashcombe and Vivian Ashcombe-Reyes sat across from us with two attorneys from Prescott and Hale. A court-appointed mediator sat at the head of the table between us. I had never seen either of them in person before, only in the polished photographs I had found online. Julian was taller than I had pictured, with the groomed, unhurried ease of a man who had never once worried about a mortgage payment. Vivian had the particular brittleness of a person who is extremely skilled at performing warmth without feeling any of it underneath. She smiled at me when I sat down. It was a very good smile. It did not reach her eyes. "We appreciate you coming," Julian said, his tone measured, rehearsed, the tone of a man fully prepared for this exact conversation. "We want to start by acknowledging that our father clearly had some kind of relationship with your family that we weren't fully aware of, and we understand this whole situation has probably been confusing for you." Relationship, as though I had spent 5 years having dinner with Victor Ashcombe, as though any part of this had ever been something I chose. "I didn't have a relationship with your father," I said carefully. "I received wire transfers I didn't ask for 5 years. I found out who was sending them only after he died." Vivian leaned forward, still smiling. "Of course, and we're not suggesting anything improper on your part. We just want to understand what he told you, or believed. He was quite ill in his final year. His judgment wasn't always what it once was. We have medical documentation to that effect." She paused delicately. "We think he may have believed he owed your family a debt that, frankly, he did not actually owe, and we're concerned that belief, possibly a product of his illness, has been given far more legal weight than it deserves." This was their argument, delivered gently, with tilted heads and carefully concerned voices. The old man was confused, he imagined a debt, and you are now profiting from an old man's confusion. I looked at Diane. She gave me nothing, just the steady, silent expectation that I would hold my ground on my own. "My attorney and I are already aware of the medical filings," I said. "We're also aware of the 1997 civil complaint my father filed against your father, the sealed settlement that followed it, and the 2 independent competency evaluations your father underwent in the final 18 months of his life, both of which found him fully competent." I kept my voice level, the same voice I use when a frightened child asks whether a shot is going to hurt. "I'm not here to relitigate what your father chose to do, or why he chose it. The will is the will." Julian's warmth shifted, just barely, a degree or less, the way light changes when a cloud crosses in front of the sun. "Miss Coleman, let me be direct. This proceeding is going to be expensive, emotionally exhausting, and very possibly public. We have the resources to sustain a long legal battle in a way that a school nurse from Bellwether may find difficult to match." He glanced at the papers in front of him. His attorney slid a folder forward. "We're prepared to offer $3 million. A full and final settlement. You walk away financially secure, with no further exposure to any of this. $3 million against $60 million, and underneath it the unspoken threat, we have more staying power than you do." I thought about Ethan in that parking lot. I thought about my father at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee he never drank. I thought about 13 years of coupons and stretched paychecks and one broken furnace away from disaster, always every month. "No," I said. Vivian's smile finally slipped, just for a second, before she smoothed it neatly back into place. "I think you should really take some time to consider this properly." "I've considered it," I said. "Thank you for coming." We stood. Diane gathered her folder. As we walked out into the gray Vermont afternoon, I felt something settle behind my sternum, Not quite fear, not quite anger, something smaller and more useful than either. The feeling of having been pushed, and having held, and knowing with total certainty that I could keep holding. I was afraid, of course. Julian Ashcombe hadn't been bluffing about resources. This was going to be long and costly, and it was going to put my name into documents, and possibly into articles, and my quiet life in Bellwether was not going to stay quiet for a good while. But I had learned, somewhere in those 5 years of birthday deposits and sleepless nights, that fear is not actually the opposite of resolve. Sometimes it's the thing that sharpens it. The hearing was set for the 14th of February, a date that struck me, when I first saw it on the court calendar, as either a cruel joke or a strange kind of fitting. Valentine's Day, the day we would find out whether the law had any love left for the truth. Diane spent the 3 months leading up to it building a case I can only describe as engineered with the same precision my father used to bring to a violin's bracing. She deposed the 2 physicians who had independently assessed Victor Ashcombe's cognitive function in the final years of his life. She subpoenaed the sealed 1997 settlement records, which, it turned out, could be compelled to open in the context of a probate contest if they were materially relevant to establishing the rationale behind the will's provisions. The judge agreed with her motion. The seal was lifted. I drove to Boston the night before the hearing and stayed in a hotel 2 blocks from the courthouse. I couldn't sleep. I lay on the stiff mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about 5 birthdays, 5 mornings at 6:02 a.m., 5 moments of disbelief while I drove my Civic with its broken air conditioning to a job that paid barely enough to keep the lights on, with no idea that a man in Boston was carrying a weight on his chest he'd hauled around for nearly 30 years. I thought about what courage looks like when it finally arrives, decades too late to matter to the person who needed it most. I thought about my father, silenced before his own courage had ever been given the chance to count for anything. And I thought, today it finally counts. What the unsealed records contained wasn't a surprise to me, not by then, but it landed in that courtroom like one anyway. The 1997 settlement documented that Victor Ashcombe had, between 1993 and 1996, secretly filed patents on a proprietary internal bracing pattern and a signature varnish formulation that my father had spent over a decade developing inside their shared workshop and had gone on to license both, under his own name alone, to instrument manufacturers across the country. The very foundation on which Ashcombe string instruments had eventually been built. My father discovered the patent filings by accident in late 1996, going through old workshop paperwork. He filed the civil complaint in early 1997. The settlement, negotiated while my father was already beginning to struggle financially, running low on the resources to sustain a real fight, gave him $140,000 and a confidentiality clause in exchange for dropping the complaint and never publicly discussing what Ashcombe had done. $140,000 for a decade of a man's genuine, original craft quietly absorbed into another man's name and another man's fortune. Victor Ashcombe's will, amended 16 months before his death, well within the documented period of his competence, contained a provision that Diane projected onto the courtroom screen for everyone to read at once. I acknowledge a debt of conscience owed to the memory of Daniel Coleman and to his daughter, Rachel and Coleman, arising from my conduct between 1993 and 1996. This bequest represents my full and complete acknowledgement of that debt. He had written it into the will. He had named the years. He had named exactly what he had done. I looked at those words projected on the screen and pressed my hands flat against my thighs under the table, so no one could see them trembling. Not from fear. I was well past fear by that point. It was something closer to recognition, the understanding that my father had been right all along at that kitchen table, and that it had taken 28 years and a dying man's conscience to finally put those words somewhere a judge could read them aloud. My throat tightened. I breathed through it. I was not going to cry in that courtroom, not because crying would have been wrong, but because I needed to stay fully present for every single second of what was happening. Julian Ashcombe's attorney tried to argue that the language was vague, that debt of conscience wasn't a recognized legal term, that it proved nothing binding. He stood at the podium and rebuilt his argument twice with slightly different phrasing, citing precedents Diane had already anticipated and dismantled in her brief. I watched him and felt, briefly, something close to pity for a man being paid handsomely to defend a position he almost certainly knew, privately, was already lost. The judge, a woman in her 60s named the Honorable Louise Abernathy, who wore the expression of someone who had heard every conceivable version of every argument and was rarely moved by any of them, let him finish completely. Then she asked one question. "Counsel, does your client dispute that the conduct described in the 1997 settlement actually took place?" A silence opened across the courtroom. Julian's attorney conferred with him in low, hurried whispers. Julian's composed expression, which had held steady through nearly 2 hours of proceedings, did something underneath the surface that I can only describe as quietly caving inward. He had walked into that room that morning in an expensive suit, with the bearing of a man who fully expected to win, the particular confidence that comes from a lifetime of winning easily against people with far fewer resources. He had never, I suspected, faced a Diane Foss. He had certainly never faced a Daniel Coleman's daughter. "Your Honor," the attorney finally said, "my client does not dispute the historical facts underlying the 1997 settlement." "Then what, specifically," Judge Abernathy said, "is the basis for a claim of diminished testamentary capacity if the testator's own stated rationale for the bequest accurately reflects documented, undisputed events?" Another silence, longer than the first. Vivian Ashcombe Reyes, sitting in the gallery, made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath, that her own attorney quieted with a subtle gesture. I did not turn to look at her. I kept my eyes on the bench. What followed wasn't dramatic, not in the way courtroom scenes are in movies. There was no breakdown, no confession, no desperate speech. What happened was quieter, and in its own way, more total. They simply ran out of argument. Every point Julian's team raised, Diane answered with documentation already in the record. Every medical claim, our 2 physicians had already rebutted under deposition. Every suggestion of undue influence collapsed against the plain fact that I had never once met, spoken to, or even known Victor Ashcombe was alive until 3 months after he had died. By the end of closing arguments, Julian Ashcombe sat very still, in the specific way a machine sits still after someone has switched it off. Vivian had stopped looking at me entirely, staring instead at some fixed point in the middle distance, as though recalculating a very large number over and over. I sat beside Diane, hands folded in my lap, and I felt not triumph exactly, but something closer to the sound of a door finally closing that had been standing open for a very long time. Judge Abernathy reserved her ruling for 7 days. I drove back to Bellwether that afternoon through flat February fields, gray in the particular way only a Vermont winter can be gray, and I stopped my Civic at the covered bridge on the edge of town, the one that always flooded in spring, and I sat there for a minute with the engine idling and said out loud to no one, "I know, Dad. I finally understand what you meant." Judge Abernathy issued her ruling on the 21st of February. Diane called me at 8:47 in the morning. "It's over," she said, and beneath her usual professional composure, I could hear something that might have been genuine satisfaction. "The contest is denied. The will stands as written. Probate is ordered to proceed without further delay." I sat down on the bottom step of my staircase. Ethan was still asleep upstairs. The house was very quiet. "All of it?" I asked. "All of it," Diane said. $60 million, held in trust exactly as Victor Ashcombe instructed. Transfer of control to you within 90 days, pending standard probate processing. A pause, papers shuffling faintly on her end of the line. The judge also issued a written opinion. She cited the 1997 settlement documentation at length and characterized the contest, in her own words, as an attempt to relitigate a previously settled matter of commercial misconduct through the mechanism of a testamentary challenge, without evidentiary foundation. I did not cry, though I had genuinely expected to. What I felt instead was more physical than emotional, a long, slow release of tension from somewhere behind my ribs that had been held tight for years, maybe since the morning my father sat across from me with his hands wrapped around a coffee he never drank and tried, in the only language he had left, to tell me what had actually happened to him. "What happens to Julian now?" I asked. "He has 30 days to appeal, which his attorneys may do reflexively, but this ruling is solid. Any appeal is going to face significant procedural barriers." Diane paused again. "Beyond that, the judge's written opinion is now public record, and it's not flattering to the Ashcombe family's reputation. The settlement documents are unsealed. What your father actually built, and what was taken from him between 1993 and 1996, is now a matter of documented fact. I hadn't pursued any of this for the sake of reputational damage. I had pursued it because it was right, and because my father hadn't had the strength left in him to fight when it would have actually mattered. But I won't pretend there wasn't some small part of me that felt the symmetry of it all settling into place. Victor Ashcombe had bought my father's silence for $140,000. The price of finally breaking that silence, paid in full 28 years later, came to $60 million. The 90 days of probate processing that followed weren't dramatic in any particular way. I met with a real wealth management firm that Diane recommended, not a Boston shell account this time, and slowly began the work of understanding what it actually meant to be responsible for a sum of money I still couldn't quite hold in my head all at once. I set aside a portion for Ethan's education immediately, without discussion, because that had been non-negotiable in my mind for 16 years already. I paid Priya back for every weekend Ethan had stayed with her, which she flatly refused until I pointed out that this was now something I could simply do without budgeting around it for months, and she laughed and let me take her to dinner instead. I retained Renata Voss on an ongoing basis, not for further investigation, but for the specific quality of attention she brought to any situation, the ability to see what was actually happening rather than what merely appeared to be happening, a skill I had come to value above almost any other. I also made one personal decision I hadn't discussed with Diane, or Renata, or anyone at all. My father's 1997 settlement had included a confidentiality clause that was now legally void, rendered moot by the very probate proceedings that had forced its unsealing. The story of what Victor Ashcombe had done to Coleman and Ashcombe's stringed instruments was, by that point, a matter of public record. I could do nothing further with it, or I could do something. I found my father's old workshop address book, kept in a shoebox in my closet for 7 years without my ever fully understanding why I hadn't thrown it out, and I wrote letters, by hand on good paper, to 6 of his former clients and conservatory contacts, explaining what the unsealed record now showed, that the bracing pattern and varnish formulation that had quietly built Victor Ashcombe's company had, in fact, originated a decade earlier in my father's small workshop. 3 of them wrote back. 1. A retired concertmaster in Providence who had commissioned a viola from my father in 1994, wrote simply, "I always suspected there was more to that instrument than the paperwork said. I'm glad, at last, to know I was right." I placed that letter inside the hollowed-out Stradivari biography, beside the green notebook and the very first bank printout. Then I drove to the covered bridge on the edge of town, and for the first time in 5 years, I took a different road home. Spring came to Bellwether the way it always does, slowly, and then all at once, the last of the snow retreating by inches until one morning you walk outside, and the air has simply changed, and you weren't watching closely enough to catch the exact moment it happened. I bought a house, not an extravagant house, not a statement of any kind, just a modest place 3 miles outside of town, set back from a quiet road I'd always liked, with enough land that Ethan could finally have the dog he'd been asking for since he was 9. We adopted him from a shelter in Burlington, a 2-year-old shepherd mix named Bramble, who chewed through one of the porch railings in his first week and then settled in as if he'd always belonged there. I took a leave of absence from the school. I hadn't planned to leave entirely, and I still missed the particular rhythm of it, the quiet, useful work of taking care of other people's children. But I needed time to think without a schedule dictating every hour of it, and for the first time in my adult life, I had that time available to me. I spent months reading everything I could find about trusts, estate management, and the legal architecture involved in protecting money meant to last more than one lifetime. I was not going to be the person who lost $60 million to ignorance or inattention. I was my father's daughter. I intended to understand in full exactly what I now held. Ethan graduated that June and was accepted into a joint program in instrument making and business administration, one he had found and applied to entirely on his own, without a single word of suggestion from me. When he told me, sitting at our new kitchen table with the acceptance letter still in his hand, I had to look away for a moment, because some kinds of symmetry are too precise to receive all at once without feeling the full weight of them. He would be, in some sense, the craftsman his grandfather had never fully been allowed to become. My friendship with Priya deepened into the particular kind that only forms once someone has seen the whole, unguarded interior of your life and chosen to stay anyway. We had lunch together every week, real lunches now, not the teacher's lounge, and Priya finally finished a graduate degree she'd put off for 11 years. I quietly paid for one full semester of it without telling her in advance, arranging it directly through the university's financial office before she ever found out. She was furious with me for roughly 40 minutes, and then hugged me for a very long time without saying anything else at all. And Julian Ashcom's appeal was filed in March and denied in May. The probate court's ruling, and Judge Abernathy's written opinion in particular, had done something Julian had clearly never anticipated. It created a public record that the financial press found with the specific hunger journalists reserve for stories about inherited wealth and quietly concealed misconduct. A regional business publication ran a detailed piece on the 1997 settlement and its implications for Ashcom's String Instruments' current licensing agreements. 2 of the company's larger institutional partners requested independent audits shortly afterward. One of those audits turned up irregularities in a royalty structure that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the exact practices his father had used 30 years earlier. I had nothing to do with any of that. I never once contacted a reporter or an investor. But I watched it unfold from my new house outside Bellwether with the detached, almost clinical attention of someone who has learned, the hard way, that consequences carry their own momentum once they've been set loose. By autumn, Julian Ashcombe had stepped down from his position at the company pending the outcome of those investor investigations. Vivian Ashcombe Reyes had, according to public filings, quietly liquidated several personal assets, apparently to cover a growing pile of legal fees of her own. I didn't feel triumphant about any of it. Mostly, I felt that the world simply has a longer memory than people like the Ashcombe children had ever needed to plan around. I went back to the school that September, not full-time, but 3 mornings a week, entirely on my own terms. I spent a weekend reorganizing the small local history case in the front hallway, cluttered and half-forgotten for years, and in a box of donated materials, I found an old photograph from 1990, one of a chamber music hall renovation 2 towns over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written the maker's name, Daniel Coleman. I had the photograph framed, and I hung it in the front hallway, under good light, where every parent and child walking past could see it. No one ever asked me why I did it, but I knew, and knowing was enough. What would you have done in my place? If your phone rang, and a number you didn't recognize flashed on the screen, would you have answered? Tell me in the comments. This story is only just beginning.